Hej och välkomna till veckans avsnitt av BibelPodden. Här sitter jag i studion, Malin Davidsson, tillsammans med
Per Evert.
Hej.
Hejsan. Vad roligt att se att du är frisk och kry hyggligt.
Ja, det är bara att tacka Herren.
Ja, för
igår kändes det inte så.
Nej, vi spelar in här på en söndag, men du låg och vilade dig. Nej, vi spelar in här på en måndag, förlåt. Ja. Igår var söndag och du låg och vilade dig.
Ja, jag kände att nu får jag nog göra så som man ska. Man får vila och be. Ja. Och läsa. Så det gjorde jag igår.
Extra skönt att du har kryat på det. Jag är med idag. Jag gjorde en kul grej igår på gudstjänsten.
Okej.
Vill du höra?
Ja, det vill jag.
Det normala är att man sitter och lyssnar då. I och för sig, jag är ute och undervisar många söndagar nu utifrån mästerverket i olika kyrkor. Och sådär,
men det var inte du som höll i gudstjänsten igår?
Nej, men däremot så var jag på söndagsskolan igår.
Ja. Där brukar jag hålla till också.
Ja, och jag har inte varit på söndagsskolan. Det heter Kungalandet i vår församling i Kungsporten. Ja. Men då var jag inbjuden till den äldsta åldersgruppen och svara på frågor om Bibeln.
Ja, vad kul. Vi har faktiskt en bibelklubb för våra äldre barn.
Jaha, hur är det
söndagsskolan och bibelklubben.
Ja.
Bibelklubben läser man Bibel.
Ja.
Och så läser man det tillsammans med en vuxen då som hjälper en att tänka och samtala om bibeltexten.
Ja, så verkar de ha gjort i den här gruppen också. Att de har jobbat med Bibeln, liksom studerat den och samtalat om den ett antal avsnitt eller veckor. Och då bjöd de in någon som var lite bibelexpert, och det råkade bli jag då, så fick besvara frågor som...
Det är bra idé.
Ja, en del frågor hade ju ledarna skrivit själva, men en del hade barna som var kanske 11-12 år. Ja. Ja. Hur upplever du dem som du möter då i söndags? Vilken ålder har du?
Nej, men jag har de yngre barnen, vilket jag tycker är roligt. Jag är egentligen förskollärare i grunden ju, så jag gillar att hänga med de små. Ja. Och det blir väldigt spontana tankar kring bibelberättelserna. Ja. Jag hade ju på påskdagen körde jag hela historien med korsfästelse och allting. Och då var det ju väldigt, vad hemskt! Och sen blev det väldigt lyckligt. Ja. Så det,
Ja, men det är fantastiskt med Bibeln att den går ju att berätta på allas nivåer. Man får bara anpassa sig till den nivå som man pratar om.
Ja, verkligen. Ja. Absolut.
Och i det här programmet då försöker vi ta upp dels sånt som vi tycker är upplysande och upplyftande och lära folk om Bibeln. Men vi tar också upp sådana bibeldebatter som dyker upp. Följde du den debatten som var i höstas, slut på hösten, om Josef någonting?
Just det. Det var en debatt om det, ett flertal artiklar hit och dit.
Det var en rätt så livlig debatt.
Jag läste inte allt som skrevs, men jag är medveten om att debatten förekom. Ja. Absolut.
Och det var märkligt just utifrån det program som vi sitter här och gör nu. För att det var faktiskt första dagen som vi satt i den här studion, du kommer ihåg, och spelade in inledningsavsnittet. Då var det en i Claphams nätverk som skickade ut ett meddelande. Nu har det kommit en ny artikel om Josef här. Och hon, professorn, hon gör det inte lätt för sin institution med den här artikeln. Ska vi försöka rekapitulera? Nu är det ju några månader sedan. Då var det ju Lena Sofia Timayer som är professor i Gamla testamentet på ALT.
Just det.
Några av de frikyrkliga samfundens teologiska institution. Som har skrivit en artikel om Josef som var väldigt revisionistisk och ändrade på hela betydelsen, hur man traditionellt har förstått den här berättelsen. Hon hade skrivit en annan artikel ett år tidigare. Jag vet inte om du kommer ihåg det, för det var också en väldigt livlig debatt. Då hade hon också gjort en ganska revisionistisk artikel om buden om sexualitet i Tredje Mosebok. Om att det egentligen handlar om något helt annat än vad man traditionellt har tänkt. Det ska
vi prata om i nästa vecka.
Det ska vi göra, och det är ju viktigt. Men jag tror att du sa någon gång att vi läser ju inte Bibeln i ett tomrum. Utan liksom, traditionen har ju någon poäng här.
Ja, men jag fick det till mig när vi hade Olof Edsinger här och han pratade om bibelsyn, eller du och Olof pratade om bibelsyn, och jag fick till mig det här praktiska tipset att vi läser ju den i en tradition. Det är 2000 år av bibelläsande. Jag är ju inte den första som sätter mina ögon på Bibeln, utan jag har ju Guds ord, Bibeln, helig ande. Men jag har ju också traditionen att vila i. Det jag tycker det var så bra.
Ja, för att det är ju också en ledtråd. Om vi tycker att här har en helt ny idé om vad det här bibeltexten
som i det här fallet nu då.
Då bör man ha ganska tunga argument med sig. Och det var därför som den här artikeln om Tredje Mosebok fick stark kritik, och även att institutionen på något vis var tvungen att gå ut och ta avstånd från vissa saker. Och så blev det också med den här Josef-debatten. Just det. Vi har ju faktiskt en bild av Josef här precis bakom oss.
Josef är med.
Ja, ni som lyssnar på det här på ljud, vi sitter ju i en inramning av gamla bibelplanscher, och den här råkar ju vara just Josef. Ja.
Men man kan väl också säga att när hon skrev sin artikel så har hon ju också sagt att det är hennes hopp att fler ska läsa precis vad som står i Bibeln.
Ja.
Och att Josefs brokighet ska få komma fram.
Ja.
Och så använder hon det här ordet regnbågsskimrande.
Precis, för att Josef, precis som nästan alla gestalter i Bibeln, de är ju brokiga i något avseende.
Det är man väl alla människor, är vi inte det?
Ja, Josef han har stora drömmar, men de grusas och han hamnar i problem. Och ibland säger han saker, speciellt när han är ung, mer än vad han egentligen borde. Men i de här texterna så la hon ju in begrepp av modern queer-teologi som aldrig har använts i traditionell bibelläsning. Och då menar ju vi att man behöver ha väldigt bra på fötterna för att presentera det.
Så det är väl bara att säga att vi följer hennes uppmaning att läsa vad som står.
Ja, det gör vi ju
men
verkligen.
Vi drar andra slutsatser.
Ja. Och det är ju inte bara vi, utan det var ju många som kritiserade det här. Och även här blev institutionen, ledningen för institutionen, på något vis tvungen att ta avstånd från vissa formuleringar. Och det är klart att det är ju svårt för en institution i längden. Men, då skrev några bibelforskare från Claphaminstitutet skrev en artikel i tidningen Dagen där de menar just att problemet är att hon misstolkade och vantolkade det som bibeltexterna faktiskt säger. Hon anger 6 bibelreferenser i den här texten och alla de är tolkade på ett annat sätt än det som Bibeln faktiskt säger. Så det var väl en sammanfattning av det. Sen åberopar den här artikeln som var i en akademisk tidskrift den rabbinska litteraturen. Hänger du med vad man menar när man säger den rabbinska litteraturen? Det kan ju dels handla om ända bak från Talmud, alltså kommentarerna till lagen som är från århundradena kring Kristi födelse. Det kan vara rabbiner som är stora och kända senare århundraden. Och det finns naturligtvis rabbiner även i vår tid. Som står
så det är ett ganska
tradition.
Vitt begrepp
egentligen. Det är ett oerhört vitt begrepp. Men traditionellt så finns det ju vissa rabbiner som är tyngre än andra. Till exempel Rashi finns det en som heter från medeltiden.
Men det är judiska ledare då kan man säga? Judiska lärare, eller?
Ja, rabbiner är ju judiska lärare. Och som då gör anspråk på att diskutera texten. Och i ett passage så säger hon att Rashi säger så här om Josef. Men om man tittar tillbaka på vad Rashi faktiskt säger så säger han någonting annat.
Så hon har parafraserat honom
frimodigt parafraserat, ja. Men jag ska ta ett test med dig. När vi läser en sån här rabbins text om Josef, för då gör man det i midrasher, kallar man det, vissa såna här texter. Som det är att man lägger ut en viss bibelvers och så diskuterar man vad kan det ligga i det här, precis som vi i vår tid predikar helt enkelt. Då lägger en ut texten: Josef var välväxt och såg bra ut. Detta kan liknas vid en mäktig man som stod på gatan och vårdade sina ögon, la om sitt hår och lyfte sina hälar. Där han stod sa han: detta är passande för mig eftersom jag är vacker och mäktig. Männen runt omkring honom på gatan sa till honom: om du verkligen är mäktig och vacker, här finns en björnhona framför dig. Alltså Potifars hustru. Res dig upp och besegra den. Får du ett intryck här av att det här är en kvinnlig beskrivning eller en manlig beskrivning med sina manliga frestelser?
Oj, om jag ska förstå att det är frestelse så måste jag veta att björnhonan då är en kvinna. Det vet man ju inte om man inte har förkunskap. Men jag får ju ingenstans någon kvinnlig konnotation på något sätt. Utan mer att det är en snygg man som står där. Ja.
Och det är precis det som texten säger, att Josef var vacker och därför som Potifars hustru blev attraherad av honom. Då. Men då skriver hon, professor Timayer, att här står det att Josef vippar på fötterna. Som är alltså i kvinnliga betydelse. Men det är inte det som texten faktiskt säger.
Vippa på fötterna i kvinnlig betydelse. Vad betyder det?
Men i alla fall. Det
vet inte jag vad det betyder.
Nej. Så att hon lutar sig onekligen mot rabbiner. Men de som gör den här typen av revisionistiska bibeltolkningar, det är ju inte Lena Sofia Timayer ensam om. Men hon är en av dem. Då lutar man sig ofta mot andra, postmoderna. Kanske inspirerade av olika typer av queer-teologi. Men det är precis som du sa, det vi vill är ju att människor ska gå tillbaka till bibeltexterna och se vad det faktiskt står. Och det gäller ju både om Josef och om andra personer.
Jag läste faktiskt, eftersom jag var hemma sjuk igår, så läste jag ett tidigare nummer av Bibeln idag där vi går igenom hela Josefberättelsen och så får man då de här skribenternas kommentarer. Så eftersom vi skulle prata om det här idag så var jag nyfiken. Så jag läste hela och nej, jag fick ingen ingen kvinnlighet och ingen regnbågsskimmer, utan snarare så framhöll man väl hans, Josefs oförvitliga karaktär, vet jag att det var någon som skrev.
Ja.
Sen levde han ju ett brokigt liv och fick vara med om mycket.
Och nu har jag faktiskt fått tag i en forskare som är bibelforskare som har skrivit en doktorsavhandling just om Josef.
Fantastiskt.
Och det är ju en bra auktoritet att gå till, tänkte jag, när vi ska få reda på vad säger Bibeln faktiskt om Josef.
Ja, det blir spännande.
Ja, så då går vi över och kopplar över till annat land.
Yes, det gör vi.
So today we are very honored and proud to have a Joseph scholar in our midst, Tobias Siegenthaler. Welcome to the Bible podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You're having such a beautiful German-sounding name. Where do you come from?
Yeah, I grew up in beautiful Switzerland, not far from the feet of the Alps. I come from the capital of Bern, and that's where I've lived most of my life.
And you're currently on a journey, you said. That's why we're interviewing you from where you are now. Where are you today?
That's correct. Yeah, I'm on the Adriatic coast of Italy, in a small town called Francavilla next to Pescara. Yes.
Also beautiful scenery. But tell us, you have been doing a lot of work on the Joseph story, and what are you doing currently as an academic or otherwise?
Yeah, as an academic, I continue doing research at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. I have a research fellowship there where I'm looking at writing in ancient Mesopotamia and how scribes were trained, how scribes wrote, where scribal communities evolved, in order to understand how writing was done in the ancient Near East. Besides that, I'm continuing my own research. I've finished working out the publishing of my thesis, which should come out in a couple of weeks or months maximum, and then other publications. And besides that, I teach at a few colleges wherever I can.
So I have read a number of doctoral dissertations. Most of them are actually quite boring to read because they're scientific stuff. But yours, I was thrilled to read. So tell me, why did you pick such a topic as the Joseph story for writing a doctoral dissertation?
Well, actually, originally, my interest was to write something on Genesis and how the Gospels pick up Genesis. Now, I thought where I would land is somewhere on Genesis 3, original sin, or this kind of more theological-minded topics. But as I was reading through the Gospels and examining the text carefully, I realized that Luke, in particular, uses a lot of very particular or specific language that only appears in Luke and in the Joseph story. And that's where my kind of lights went off, and I thought there might be something here more to it. And you can see that when Jesus is in the synagogue in Nazareth, the people ask, is this not the son of Joseph? So that's where the journey kind of began for me, yes.
Yes, that's an interesting question. There's sort of a double pattern, you mean, why they ask if he's the son of Joseph, the carpenter in Nazareth, but you see an analogy to the Joseph in the Old Testament too.
Yeah, indeed. You could just think that possibly it's just a coincidence that Jesus' father is called Joseph, and maybe it's just a coincidence that the people in Nazareth are kind of saying, oh, is this not the Joseph guy? But if you look a bit closer, not only in the Gospel of Luke, but also in Matthew and elsewhere, you see that there might be something else going on. I don't know if you want me to elaborate briefly on how this looks like, but yeah, I think there might be something else going on rather than just a few coincidences.
Yeah, but it's so fascinating to read a doctoral dissertation that actually focuses on how the Bible is connected within, rather than just focusing on different small parts which you feel describe as separate from each other. But you really see a pattern going on from the Joseph story to the New Testament.
Indeed, and I think this is actually a way that the New Testament writers are telling us how they are reading the Old Testament texts. It seems to me that we should learn to read the Gospels in particular more like commentary literature, that they are giving us an indication of how they are reading those texts in the light of Jesus' death and resurrection and life, obviously, as well.
Well, you use a term you call for narrative analogies. You look for narrative analogies in the biblical texts. What do you say? How do these analogies function?
Okay, right. So it's a little bit like in music. A DJ can take a melody and he can do a remix. And when the people who are listening to his music, they hear the remix, they remember the other story. And so when textual writers are doing this kind of analogy, they want you to think of this other figure or this other person. And in order to remind you, or in order to make a theological point, either to create a kind of a contrast, or to say, hey, this guy is like that guy, but he's bigger or greater or less so. So it's a kind of a poetic tool that they use.
Right. And you see it when you compare the New Testament text to the Joseph texts, but you also see it within the Joseph story itself. You sort of describe the Joseph story as a big chiasm, where the first part mirrors the last part and so on. Could you lead us through the Joseph story, how it's described in this way?
Now, yeah, that's correct. And that's actually not something that I came up with. Several scholars have seen the structure of the Joseph story in that chiastic structure. I call these different sections on either side pit stories. I can start like this. In Genesis chapter 37, we have the brothers conspiring against Joseph to a pit and then finally send him to Egypt. In Egypt, chapter 39, we have Potiphar's wife. Now, we are on the royal court. We have Potiphar's wife seducing Joseph. Joseph refuses, and she pulls him by his dress. He's getting undressed the second time, and he lands in prison. Later on in the prison, he talks about the prison as a pit. So this is the second pit of Joseph. Then in the pit, he meets some two ominous figures called the baker or the chief baker and the chief cupbearer or the chief wine pourer, as it says in the Greek text. These guys have dreams and Joseph interprets it to them. And then he tells the cupbearer, please, when you get out, would you remember me, please? The cupbearer does not remember Joseph at first, but only when Pharaoh has dreams. And that's when the cupbearer says, hey, there was a guy in prison, he interpreted those dreams to me. And that's kind of the middle of the chiasm, when Joseph is brought out of prison and he is dressed for a first time. And then later, when Pharaoh gives him all the power in Egypt, he gives him a second time a dress. So the dresses that he lost, he's been given again.
And
then when the brothers come to, sorry.
Yeah, come on, continue.
Yeah, so when the brothers come to Egypt, we have Joseph now throwing the brothers into prison. And he brings them out on the third day and says, hey guys, I want you to bring Benjamin. Now, you see how Joseph was in prison in Egypt and the brothers are in prison in Egypt. So this is kind of, now we are on the other side of the chiasm. And when they finally come back with Benjamin, they're being put into a similar situation like they were in back then when they sold Joseph at the pit. Benjamin is never thrown into a pit, but Joseph puts them into a situation where they have to decide, are we going to enslave the second son of Rachel once again, like we did back then, or are we going for a different solution? And lo and behold, there is this surprising turnaround where Judah, the very guy who had said that they should sell Joseph for silver, is now standing up and says, no, we cannot do that. I will give my life for his life, because otherwise our father Jacob, Israel, will die. And so Judah gives his life for Benjamin, the little one, the youngest one. And there we see probably the reason why Judah later gets the kingship. But in the moment when Judah gives his life, that's the moment when now Joseph says, it is me, your brother, and the family comes together and is reconciled. So that's kind of the chiasm. We have 2 times one of the sons of Rachel being in trouble, danger of death. Then in the middle parenthesis, we have Joseph in prison and we have the brothers in prison. And in the very middle of the chiasm, we have Joseph coming out of prison. The one who was enslaved now becomes the prime minister of Egypt. So from the very bottom to the very top, there is this amazing flip or turnaround, as Mary later sings about in the Gospel of Luke, that those who were down are brought up and those who were up were brought down.
Yes. And if
So that's kind of the chiastic structure.
Yeah, if you look behind me, perhaps you see a little bit of an old school drawing that we used in Sweden, which is actually the scene where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And we didn't plan this, but it happened to be behind me here. So this is a very central
Right.
scene. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And I think it's the scene that Luke is drawing on when Jesus reveals himself to the disciples, that it is me, don't you reckon, don't you fear, etc., etc. So, but we're already jumping ahead here, so let me hold off a little.
Yeah, but because we could go through the entire Old Testament. You give several analogies from Israel's liberation from the slavery in Egypt and other central biblical passages which remind us of the Joseph story. Could you lead us a bit through some of these examples?
All right, yeah. Actually, I just 2 weeks ago I came across a very interesting publication which kind of confirms what I saw there, and it unfortunately didn't make it into my dissertation. So, but it's nevertheless worth mentioning it here. The role of the cupbearer in prison becomes very important, because the cupbearer is the one who remembers Joseph and brings him out, and that role of the cupbearer is a figure that is picked up in different sections in the literature. We have the book of Nehemiah being the cupbearer, and he remembers Jerusalem, and the king says, "Why do you look sad?" Similar phrases and language like what we see in the Joseph story. And then the king says, "Oh, what is your trouble?" And then he helps Nehemiah rebuild Jerusalem. And in the book of Tobit, we see the cupbearer. There are several of these stories. But what's interesting is that in the ancient Near East, this was a known pattern, that a cupbearer would have the central changing figure. And in the ancient Near Eastern literature, actually the cupbearer later becomes the king. He is the one who will become the king. And as we will see later in our conversation, this is exactly the role that the New Testament writer, in particular Luke, assigns to Jesus, that he becomes the cupbearer. But this kind of scene of Joseph coming out of prison is very important, I think, also for the writers of the Exodus story. The Exodus is the imprisonment of not of Joseph, but of Israel in Egypt. And how are they coming out? It is God who sends not his servant. Well, he sends his servant Moses, just like Pharaoh sent his servants to bring Joseph out of prison. Now Moses is sent to Egypt to bring Israel out of Egypt. And there are quite a few parallels, in particular in the Old Greek text. It uses this verb exago, to lead out. It is used the first time to describe Joseph coming out, and then also later it is used for this for the Israelites being led out. But another word is also important, the verb that is used for pulling somebody out or up. And it's used the first time when Joseph is pulled out of the first pit. It's used the second time in all of the Torah when Joseph is brought out of prison and pulled up on a chariot, and he is made the prime minister of Egypt. And later, when God speaks to Jacob and says, "Jacob, you can go down to Egypt. I myself will pull you and your people out of Egypt," that verb is used again. And obviously, at the burning bush, that's the verb that God is using when he says, "I will pull you out of Egypt." Again. So we see already the translators of the Hebrew Bible, they saw this connection and they enhanced it by using a very particular verb to enhance this connection with the Joseph story. So there are several of these books that do this kind of follow this kind of central turning point of the Joseph story.
And one very interesting example, I haven't thought about that much before, but you give a really interesting case for how the Esther story of Esther and Mordecai, they mirror the Joseph story and also connect it to the Jesus story. Could you help us how this is written?
Yeah, right. That is really indeed very interesting. And as you could see in the footnotes of that chapter, which is an entire, quite a large chapter in my book, there has been a lot of research being done. So I'm not the first one to see this. I'm just the one who puts all the dots together, so to speak. So the Esther story, Mordecai and Esther somehow portrayed as Joseph figures who are instrumental for this turning point. But in the Esther story, there is no baker and no cupbearer. But you also have this little story in the Esther book, I think it's in chapter, is it in chapter 3? Now my memory fails me, but we have this episode of these two bodyguards who are trying to kill the king, conspire against the king. The king finds out and he hangs them on a pole. And then he writes it in his memoirs, in his remembrances, if you want so, in the Hebrew and the Greek text, he writes into his remembrances what Mordecai has done, because Mordecai was the one who alerted him about this conspiracy. And later, at the very center of the book of Esther, the king now this time doesn't have bad dreams. The king cannot sleep, and he remembers as he is reading in his memoirs, in his the royal remembrances or annals. He is reading about Mordecai, and he says, "Hey, have we ever honored him?" And they say no. And then he calls Haman, and he says, "Bring this guy out and put him on a horse and give him a beautiful robe, etc., etc." And we are reminded of Joseph, who was brought out of prison and honored. The only difference there is that Mordecai doesn't receive the ring on the finger. That's the big difference. And that raises the anticipation. How is this problem going to be resolved? How is Haman, the chief enemy in that book, how is he going to be overcome? Because the ring is still on the finger of Haman. And as we see, the drama continues. And then with allusions actually also to the Exodus story, Esther makes a meal for the king, and she invites the king and Haman, and then she invites him for another meal, and then at the second time she asks him for a favor. And a lot of commentators have seen that in that case Esther looks like the Judah figure, Judah who gave his life for Benjamin. But now this time Esther is from Benjamin, and she gives her life for the Judeans, for the Judah people. So this inversion. And this the New Testament writer,
it was so exciting how the threads are connected here when we look at the chronology. I hadn't thought about this before, that either Esther goes to the king ready to sacrifice herself on the 15th of Nisan, same day as Jesus' crucifixion, or Haman is hung on the pole this day, depending on how you understand the chronology. Isn't this fascinating?
Exactly. And it all falls together with Passover. So you have all these allusions to Passover, which again, obviously are then picked up in the gospel stories. So the gospel story is able to then combine all these narratives when they are telling about the ultimate redemption, which is brought about through Jesus, who is obviously a Judah guy who does not just risk his life, but he gives his life. But because they also see that Joseph also played his part in it, they want to combine it with Joseph. And because Joseph stands for the northern kingdom, Judah stands for the southern kingdom, in Jesus, those two figures are united. They are brought together. The wine man, Judah, and the bread man, Joseph, are brought together in Jesus. And that's why the cupbearer and the baker are just another image of Judah and Joseph, who are there in the prison, in the point of death, meeting Joseph.
So help us out in your main conclusion that the Joseph example is closely relating to the Jesus story. Give us some of your main points there.
Yeah, so it's interesting how the gospel writers, when they portray Jesus' betrayal through Judas, they seem to link Jesus back to Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers, but it was Judah, the namesake of Judas, who suggested selling Joseph for silver. So there we see quite a clear connection that you have the 12, you have silver, and you have them sitting down and eating bread. But in the gospel story, they're not only eating bread, they're also drinking wine. So there is a different element there, which is interesting, which links in a way more to the end of the Joseph story, when Joseph brings, where all the 12 brothers come to Egypt, and they sit down, they eat bread, and they drink wine. And it is actually a redemptive meal in a way. So we see the meal of betrayal is at the same time in the gospel is also the meal of redemption. So in a way, what the gospel writer Luke is doing, he's combining this chiasm, he's folding the chiasm together, and he's putting these two meals together, that simultaneously the meal of betrayal, where Judas betrays Jesus, is also the meal of redemption, where Judah, the second Judah, gives his life for the brother of the other mother, for Benjamin. And this is what Luke connects to when later in the story he says that Jesus was going to the cross instead of Barabbas, the son of the father. So there we have this pattern once again. I have now not spoken about the allusions to Genesis 39, where we have this whole discussion about day by day, Potiphar's wife was speaking to Joseph, trying to hold him. Jesus, when he's arrested, he says to the people arresting him, day by day I was with you, not in the house, but in the temple. And you did not you did not grab me, or you did not arrest me. So they came to look for him outside the house, because there were always people in the house, so to speak. So there is also an allusion there to the Potiphar story. And interestingly enough, it seems Potiphar is like the chief henchman of Pharaoh, which newer studies of what the role of Satan or what the meaning of Satan is, that actually Satan means more something like the chief executioner or something like that. It seems this may be something that is the reason why the gospel writers are also alluding to the Potiphar story when they are talking about Jesus's arrest.
Yeah, and this makes sense to the Potiphar story and the relationship between Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and Potiphar, of Joseph being righteous in the risk of temptation.
Exactly.
Yeah, connecting to how Jesus behaves the same. And it's also fascinating how you have connected how many things happen on the third day, both in the Joseph story and in the Esther story and in the Jesus story.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah, that's correct. In particular, with Luke in particular, because Luke says that Jesus, when he is raised on the third day, he is explaining the scriptures to the disciples. And he says that, don't you know that all the scriptures are talking about me having to suffer and being raised on the third day, which, by the way, is something that goes into the early church tradition all the way to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, where it says that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate and was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. So we have to ask ourselves where. And one of the first stories where this third day appears, one is obviously the story with Abraham going up on Mount Moriah, and on the third day, Isaac is given back to them, coming back to life. But the next story is where not Abraham's son, but Jacob's son is in prison, and he is there together with the cupbearer and the baker. And he says to the cupbearer, on the third day, you will be brought out. And the baker, he's not brought out, and he's not brought back to life, but he's hung on a pole. And that's very interesting, because it says that Jesus is saying that the scriptures talk about him being crucified or suffered. Well, the baker, he, in the Aramaic translation, it says that he is crucified. So here we have the first individual in all of the scriptures of Israel that somebody is crucified, is hung on a pole. And we have bread and wine. And then we have this phrase of one of the thieves talking to Jesus and saying the same words that Joseph says to the cupbearer. remember me when you are in your kingdom. Joseph says to the cupbearer, remember me when you are with Pharaoh. So we see clearly that the gospel writers are trying to link to this central story of Joseph's turnaround, where Joseph is now being remembered and being brought out. So I think you can see very clearly these links, and other people have actually seen that, and you can find that in the footnotes of my book.
Det är så fantastiskt roligt för oss som får förmånen att vara med och göra de här programmen Bibelpodden och sprida Guds ord till Sverige och till alla som vill se och lyssna och höra mer om Bibeln, fördjupa sig mer av Bibeln, fascineras mer av Bibeln. Och vi vill gärna göra det tillsammans med dig. Så att på olika sätt så kan du berätta om det här programmet, dela det vidare till dina vänner via dina nätverk och sociala medier och på andra sätt. Kanske bjuda in någon av oss som är med och gör de här programmen till att berätta om Bibeln i din församling. Be för programmet får du gärna göra, och du får gärna ge till programmet också så att vi har möjlighet att göra Bibelpodden och berätta om böckernas bok, den mest fantastiska samling skrifter som har producerats som Guds stora räddningsplan till mänskligheten. Tack för att du var med och stödjer oss i det här programmet. Yeah, and you don't only see patterns going forwards from Joseph to Jesus, you also see him going backwards to the garden story. For instance, when Joseph asks his brothers, "What have you done?" It connects back to God's question in the garden, isn't that so?
That's exactly right. And that question is so central, I think, to the overall arc of Genesis, because that question appears exactly 8 times, and 7 times that question indicates the kind of repeating of the cycle of the breaking down of relationships, of the dysfunctional family, of the loss of the garden. And then the 8th time, it's when Joseph asks the brothers, "What have you done?" And in that moment, Judah steps up and says, "Yes, we are guilty." He confesses. And that's actually connected to the meaning of his name. His name does not only mean praise, it also means confession. So Judah confesses his sins, and then he says, "I will give my life." He has pledged his life for Benjamin, and I will give my life in the place of Benjamin. And that's the moment there where the eyes, in a positive way, their eyes are opened and they recognize each other again. Whereas throughout Genesis, you see that something is happening to the eyes when they eat from the forbidden fruit. And throughout Genesis, people don't recognize each other. The brothers don't recognize Joseph in Egypt. Even Jacob himself does not recognize the right wife. And when Jacob himself goes and betrays his father, Isaac does not recognize that this is Jacob. So we see that the fall affects the eyes. And now with Judah, all of a sudden, this is reversed. And they can recognize each other, and there can be real reconciliation. And this is a theme that is being picked up and very carefully constructed so that Judah at the end is the one who brings about the important turnaround. And maybe we could say that Judah is really the hero of the book of Genesis. Although we would have to say the person who did change Judah from the one who sells his brother to the one who gives his life for his brother is Tamar. And I think we have kind of not seen the importance of Tamar, and I'm about to publish an article on Tamar and her role within the book of Genesis. So that's a little teaser there.
Yeah, good thing to keep our eyes open to. But if we look into the future of the biblical story, everything is knitted together in the book of Revelation, which also captures back to this story about the lion and the lamb and the beast of Judah and of Joseph. How do you knit this up together?
You have really read my thesis very carefully.
Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Per. That's wonderful how you engage with it. Yeah, I do think that is there, because in Revelation 5, it says that John the Revelator gets to hear a word, and it says, "Behold, the lion from the tribe of Judah." And then he looks, and it says, "And he saw a lamb." And I think that connects back once again to that story where Judah gives his life for Benjamin. Why, you may ask? Well, actually, what's interesting, if you are looking carefully, you see that the mother of Joseph and of Benjamin, her name is Rachel. Rachel means mother sheep. By the way, you find that very word The only time it's used as mother sheep in Isaiah 53, which talks about the sheep that are led to the slaughter. That tells you that Joseph and Benjamin, they're like little lambs. They're little sheep lambs. And when now Judah steps up and say, I will take his place, you can see how the lion becomes the lamb, how he takes the shape of the lamb, he takes the shape of the servant. And as you have probably noticed, I pulled this all the way to Luke, where Jesus on the Last Supper sits with the disciples, and the disciples are debating over who is the greatest, who will sit on top, etc. And Jesus says in Luke, he doesn't say the one who wants to be greatest should become the least or the servant. He says the one who wants to be greatest should become like the youngest. And that's the title for Benjamin. And that shows you that this is the true Judah power. The Judah, the lion who takes the place of the lamb. So yes, I do think it connects all the way to Revelation.
Yeah, this is so inspiring. I have rarely read a doctoral dissertation that has been like a sermon to me, but this has. So if we look for the book that is about to be published, it's called From Joseph to Jesus. Is that so?
Correct. Yes, correct. It has a longer subtitle, but let's leave it with From Joseph to Jesus. People can remember that well. It appears in the Peters publishing house in Leuven, in Belgium. Look out for it. It should come out in the next 2-3 months. And I'm also very happy to receive emails and feedback on that.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Tobias, for being with us here at the Bible Podcast. And thank you for the doctoral and scholarly work you have done on the Joseph story.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you for my invitation and for a wonderful conversation here. It's always great to engage with people who have actually read our work closely and not just kind of superficially. It's so rewarding because as a scholar, we spend weeks and years with these texts. So it's nice when somebody engages closely with it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Det där var spännande att lyssna på.
Ja, visst är det så. När vi går tillbaka till vad bibeltexterna faktiskt säger om en gestalt som Josef och vad vi finner där i.
Jättehäftigt. Ja. Jag förundras. Varje gång jag lär mig någonting nytt så förundras jag av den här längtan att lära mig ännu mer och läsa ännu mer Bibel.
Ja, och man kan ju bara titta på den här bilden som vi sitter framför här. Den här scenen, just när Josef ger sig till känna för sina bröder.
Ja, det är en väldigt spännande historia.
Det är oerhört fascinerande. Det är sådana känslodramer som ligger här. Både Josef, liksom, hur han gråter, hela tiden gråter Josef. Och hans bröder, hur de ångrar sig från djupet och förstår vad de har gjort. Och så kommer nåden och barmhärtigheten här.
Och bara lyfter och frälser.
Ja, nej, men det är spännande att höra hur Bibeln gång på gång målar de här mönstren som gång på gång pekar framåt mot Jesus.
Just det. Den store frälsaren.
Och så tänker jag också att det är ju en bra påminnelse till oss det här med att inte låta vår tids ideologier och teologier lägga sig över bibeltexten och tolka den utifrån den. Därför att ideologierna skiljer sig åt hela tiden. Utan gå tillbaka till bibeltexten. Just
det, gå till källan. Sen lever vi ju i vår värld och vi färgas av människor vi möter och strömningar och får vi hela tiden påminna oss. Gå tillbaka till texten, gå tillbaka till Guds ord och låta oss färgas av det.
Ja, för att strömningar, de åker ju hit och dit och pendlar, går fram och tillbaka. I just vår tid så är det den här typen av queer-teologi som har påverkat. Men det är inte alls säkert att den gäller om 10 år eller om 50 år om Herren dröjer. Och då är det bättre att stå kvar i det som texterna faktiskt säger.
Ja, och vi ska ju få prata nästa vecka.
Precis, vi håller kvar oss i de här ämnena.
Om lite relationer och sånt där. Ja. Det blir spännande.
För att Josef är ju ett av exemplen på den som drabbas av just en sexuell frestelse och klarar av att övervinna den. Ändå får lida, men upprättas senare. Så vi väjer inte för de kontroversiella ämnena i det här programmet.
Nej, det är roligt att prata om det.
Ja, det är ju framförallt viktigt då, eftersom vår tid har en tendens att dras iväg. Och även kyrkan har en frestelse av att påverkas av samtidens ideologier.
Ja, nej, men det är viktigt att ta i det.
Ja. Så då tackar vi väl för oss för den här gången.
Det gör vi.
Ja, och tackar till dig som har lyssnat och tittat och hälsar dig hjärtligt välkommen åter nästa vecka.
Yes, tack så mycket.